Here's PragerU to rationalize their opposition to making it easier to vote.
Is there a problem with universal mail-in balloting?
I'm sure you can come up with some hypothetical catastrophes that could hypothetically happen.
Sounds simple enough. You fill out a ballot, stick it in the mail, somebody counts it on election day.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The ballots also have to be screened. Also, I would hope that this would not all be done in one day. I would have more confidence in an election if greater time were taken to ensure that proper procedures were followed.
In fact, we already do that with absentee ballots, right? So why would universal mail-in balloting be any different? Well, the biggest difference is that with absentee ballots, the voter specifically asks for a ballot. With universal mail-in balloting, ballots are mailed out en masse.
Well, that sounds much better. I'd hate to have to apply for a ballot and then rely on some bureaucracy to process my application and hopefully actually send me one.
Millions of people who would normally go to the polls vote by mail instead. No national election has ever been conducted this way.
Lots of state elections have, though. Do you have any evidence that the problems with universal mail-in ballots at the state level have altered the outcome of a single election?
And there are very good reasons to be concerned that one ever should. Reason number 1, bureaucratic incompetence. I don't think I have to sell you on the idea that when the government bureaucracy takes on a big new project with little preparation, the results aren't pretty.
So then let's do lots of preparation. Insofar as the problem is insufficient preparation, it can be fixed as simply as just increasing the amount of preparation.
We've seen those results as it relates to mail-in balloting already. Wisconsin was one of the first states to hold a primary in the coronavirus era. It saw an influx in mail-in votes as a result. Predictably, this led to serious snafus. Thousands of requested ballots were not sent.
Which, as I already said, is a great reason to just send out the ballots to everyone instead of having to rely on government bureaucracy to reliably process thousands of requests.
1,600 ballots were found in a mail processing center the day after the election. 23,000 votes were rejected due to missing signatures or other missing information.
Well, that's not a problem with government bureaucracy. That's a problem with people not being properly informed about how to fill out the ballot. The proper way to handle that is to allow people to cure their ballots.
And those are the mistakes we know about in just one state and in one primary election, when fewer people than in the general election typically bother to cast a vote.
Whenever a conservative says, and those are just the ones who got caught, what they are telling us is that we ought to be afraid of crimes for which they have little evidence. They do the same thing with undocumented migrants. They will cite statistics about how many folks got caught trying to illegally cross the border, which most reasonable people would infer to be evidence of the efficacy of enforcement, and then they ask us to imagine all the undocumented folks who didn't get caught. They tell us that we ought to be afraid of these hypothetical migrants. Similarly, they want us to fear all of the hypothetical undetected voter fraud, which, because it is undetected, is fraud for which they have no evidence at all. Now, of course, I'm not saying that no crimes ever go uncaught. What I'm saying is that the rhetorical trick of asking people to imagine folks who didn't get caught is a very convenient way of getting around having to actually present evidence of one's claims about the severity of the problem. As such, it makes sense to view such claims with extreme suspicion. Is there a single example in the US of voter fraud so rampant that it has altered the outcome of a single election? If there is, when did that happen?
In Pennsylvania, where they delayed the date of their primary to get better prepared for the expected increase in mail-in balloting, they still couldn't handle the volume. Half of Philadelphia's votes were still uncounted a week after the election. In Virginia, more than 500,000 applications for ballots were mailed with incorrect information. Some of the applications went to the wrong addresses.
Which is all the more reason to send ballots to every address. That way, nobody goes without a ballot.
Some went to dead voters. One even went to a pet.
So what? If the ballots are screened as they come in, as they should be, then it's better to send out too many than too few. You can simply reject the ballots that come from ineligible voters.
Under the best of circumstances, the bureaucracy struggles with mail-in balloting. Under less than the best of circumstances, that's not a scenario we want to face.
Why would sending out mail-in ballots be a bigger challenge for bureaucracy than setting up polling stations? If states can't handle the volume of ballots sent by mail, how can they handle the volume of ballots filled out at polling stations? It's hard for me to see mailing out lots of ballots to be a bigger threat to elections than setting up too few polling stations, resulting in people waiting in line for several hours to vote. If conservatives were genuinely concerned about the dangers of mail-in ballots and drop boxes, they would massively expand the number of polling stations. The fact that Republicans frequently reduce the number of polling stations reveals their real problem with mail-in ballots and drop boxes. Their real problem is the belief of dubious accuracy that higher voter turnout correlates with a higher proportion of votes for Democrats.
Which brings us to reason number 2 for concern: shoddy security. Here's what the New York Times said about voting by mail in an article in 2012. Keep in mind, they were talking about traditional absentee balloting, not a mass mail-in of ballots. There is a bipartisan consensus that voting by mail, whatever its impact, is more easily abused than other forms.
What does whatever its impact mean? If its impact is that it makes it a lot easier to vote, then that is a good thing. So the abuse would have to be great enough to overcome the advantages of voting by mail. Unless you can show that mail-in ballots resulted in enough fraud to change the results of an election, then you have not shown that the risk of fraud outweighs the advantages of mail-in ballots.
No kidding. In May 2020, New Jersey conducted its first ever all-mail election. 1 month later, 2 elected officials were among 4 charged with criminal conduct involving mail-in ballots.
Sounds like election security measures are in place and actually working.
One operative confessed to stealing ballots, both completed and uncompleted, out of mailboxes. Other operatives compiled a database of signatures of prospective voters and then used them to fill out ballots on behalf of their preferred candidates. And we only know about it because they got caught.
Again, the "those were just the ones who got caught" line is subtly telling us that we ought to be afraid of hypothetical criminals who have never been convicted.
Election fraud only figures to get easier because of a new weapon in the cheater's arsenal: ballot harvesting. This is the term for when a third party, usually a campaign worker or activist, goes to people's homes and collects their ballots. With ballot harvesting, you don't even have to put your ballot in the mailbox.
When has ballot harvesting ever been proven to have changed the result of any election ever? If this dude's complaint is that maybe it could, then again, he is asking us to be afraid of a boogeyman whose existence has not been proven.
Vote harvesting that targets senior citizens for their ballots even has its own name: granny farming. Reason number 3 to be concerned: the likelihood of long delays in determining final results. Americans are used to knowing who won and who lost within hours of the polls closing on Election Day. Of course, some close races take longer to sort out, but the longer it takes, the less legitimate an election seems.
To you, maybe. To me, the longer it takes, the less rushed it looks. Why would you put more trust in an election whose results were reported mere hours after the ballots were received? Doesn't it take time to ensure the legitimacy of the ballots? The sooner the election is called, the less fair that election seems to me. This dude is living like he thinks every day is opposite day.
That is exactly what happened in the 2000 presidential election, Bush v. Gore. Then, the dispute was focused on a single state, Florida. It was finally settled by the Supreme Court over a month later.
Yeah, the reason that this election didn't look legitimate is not because it took too long. In fact, the exact opposite is true. The reason it didn't look legitimate is because it didn't take long enough. There were ongoing recounts to which the Supreme Court ordered a premature halt. That is what made it look fishy.
If we have a national election that relies heavily on mail-in voting, we're almost certain to see a significant delay before we get the final results. From the post office to the vote counters, the system is just not set up for it.
If the problem is that the system is not set up for more convenient voting, then why not improve the system instead of forbidding more convenient voting?
In a close contest involving massive mail-in voting, lawsuits disputing the results are inevitable. This could delay final results even longer. And instead of involving a single state, it's likely to involve multiple states.
If you're really concerned about election integrity, then you should see additional scrutiny to be a good thing.
This is a recipe for civil unrest as frustration and fear of a stolen election grips voters.
How would an increase in judicial oversight result in a fear of a stolen election? Generally, the more courts look at the results and the more they conclude that they are legitimate, the greater my confidence in the validity of an election. The only circumstance in which that is not the case is if the courts put a stop to recounts or other investigations, as was the case with Bush v. Gore. The biggest irony of that case was that Justice Scalia said that allowing a recount to continue would put a needless and unjustified cloud over Bush's legitimacy. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. Calling a stop to the recounts put a cloud over Bush's legitimacy.
Bureaucratic incompetence, shoddy security, long delays. These are just some of the concerns any reasonable person should have over universal mail-in balloting.
By reasonable person, this guy seems to mean person who thinks every day is opposite day.
What's the solution? Simple. If you need to vote absentee, request a ballot.
Earlier, you said that requested ballots often didn't get to the folks who requested them. You don't have to worry about this as much if ballots are sent out to everyone.
Otherwise, vote like you always have, in person.
You mean where I have to wait in line for hours? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.